sham unalivings were a double child unaliving committed in Soham, Cambridgeshire, England on the 4th of August 2002. The victims were two 10-year-old girls, Holly Marie Wells and Jessica Amy Chapman, who were lured into the home of a local resident and school caretaker, Ian Kevin Huntley, who subsequently unalived the children, likely via asphyxiation, before disposing of them in an irrigation ditch close to RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk. The girls' bodies were discovered on the 17th of August 2002. Huntley was convicted of the unaliving of both girls on the 17th of December 2003 and sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment, the High Court later imposing a minimum term of 40 years. His girlfriend, Maxine Ann Carr, the girls' teaching assistant, had knowingly provided Huntley with a false alibi. She received a 3.5-year prison sentence for conspiring with Huntley to pervert the course of justice. The search for Holly and Jessica in the 13 days of their disappearance has been described as one of the most intense and extensive in British criminal history. At 11:45am on Sunday the 4th of August 2002, Jessica Chapman left her home in Brook Street, Soham, for a barbecue at the home of her best friend Holly Wells in nearby Red House Gardens. She told her parents that she was going to give her friend a necklace engraved with the letter H that she had purchased for her on a recent family holiday to Menorca. The two girls and their friend Natalie Parr played computer games and listened to music for about half an hour before Parr returned home. By 3:15pm, both girls had changed into distinctive replica Manchester United football shirts, one of which belonged to Wells and the other belonged to her older brother Oliver. At 5:04pm, Wells' mother took a photograph of the two before the children ate dinner with the other guests. They returned playing upstairs in the house at about 6:10pm. Around 6:15pm, the two girls left the Wells residence without informing anyone to purchase sweets from a vending machine at the local sports centre. While returning to 4 Red House Gardens, Well and Chapman walked past the college close home of Ian Huntley, the senior caretaker at the local secondary school. Huntley evidently lured the girls into his house, saying his girlfriend Maxine Carr, the girls' teaching assistant at St Andrew's Primary School, was in the house. She was in fact visiting her mother in Grimsby, Lincolnshire. The precise events after the girls entered 5 College Close are unknown, but the investigators believe to be true sections of Huntley's claims in interviews to the media prior to his arrest, and in his later trial testimony, such as that he had been cleaning his dog at the time the girls passed the house at around 6:30pm, and that one girl had a nosebleed. The cause of death for both girls was later ruled to be asphyxiation. Chapman's Nokia 6110 mobile phone was switched off at 6:46pm. At 6pm, Nicola Wells entered her daughter's bedroom to invite the girls to say goodbye to the guests, only to discover both children missing. Alarmed, she and her husband Kevin searched the house and nearby streets. Minutes after their daughter's 8:30pm curfew had expired, Nicola Wells phoned the Chapmans to ask if the girls were there, only to learn Leslie and Sharon Chapman were worried that their youngest daughter had not returned home. Following frantic efforts by families to locate the daughters, Well and Chapman were reported missing by their parents at 9:55pm. Police immediately launched an intensive search for the missing children. Over 400 officers were assigned full-time to search for the girls. These officers conducted extensive house-to-house inquiries across Soham. Their efforts to search local terrain were supported by hundreds of local volunteers and later some United Air Force personnel stationed at nearby air bases. To help their public appeals for information, Cambridgeshire Police released the photograph Nicola Wells had taken of the children less than 2 hours before their disappearance, depicting both girls wearing their Manchester United replica football shirts. A physical description of each girl was also released to the media, describing them as being white, about 4'6" tall and slim. Chapman was described as being tanned with shoulder-length brown hair. Wells was described as being fair with blonde hair. The parents of both girls stated that their daughters had been wary of talking with strangers, having been warned not to trust people that they did not know from early childhood. This was supported by the head teacher of St Andrew's Primary School, who told reporters, suspecting the children had been kidnapped, investigators questioned every registered offender in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Over 260 registered offenders across the UK, including 15 high-risk files, were questioned or were eliminated from the investigation. Police also investigated the possibility that the girls had arranged to meet someone that they had contacted via an internet chat room, but this was soon ruled out. On the 8th of August, CCTV footage of the girls recorded minutes before their disappearance was released to the public. This footage depicted them arriving at the local sports centre at 6:28 p.m. A televised reconstruction of the girls' last known movements was broadcast nationally on the 10th of August. And both sets of parents granted an interview with presenter Colin Baker on ITV's programme Tonight, which was broadcast on the 12th of August. Other family members and friends of both girls also appealed via the media for the safe return of the children. These appeals for information on the whereabouts of Wells and Chapman produced over 2,000 phone calls and tips from the public, with all information obtained entered into the investigation's Holmes 2 database. The community held a candlelight vigil on the 7th of August. Shortly after the children's disappearance, Staffordshire Police contacted the investigating officers to report their suspicions the girls could have been abducted by the same man responsible for an abduction in their jurisdiction the previous year, in which a 6-year-old girl had survived an indecent assault by an abductor who was still at large and whose green Ford Mondeo had number plates which had earlier been seen in Peterborough. This person responsible for the abduction and assault was also believed to have followed a 12-year-old girl in the same area, although in this instance his car had been fitted with number plates which had been stolen in Nottinghamshire. The same vehicle had recently been sighted in Glatton, Cambridgeshire. This information was later included in a televised appeal about the children's disappearance on BBC's Crime Watch, but this potential lead failed to bear fruit. Several members of the public reported having seen the children in the early days of the investigation. Mac Tuck informed investigators that he had driven past the girls on Sand Street in Soham town centre at approximately 6:30 p.m. on the 4th of August. His attention had been drawn towards their Manchester United replica shirts, causing him to remark to his wife Lucy. Karen Greenwood also reported seeing the girls walking arm in arm along College Road about 2 minutes later. Another woman living in nearby Little Thetford claimed to have seen two girls whose appearance and clothing matched those of Wells and Chapman walking past her home the morning after they had been reported missing. Police also received statements regarding a suspicious white van that had been seen in Soham on the evening of the child's disappearance. Investigators located and seized this vehicle from a caravan park in Wentworth on the 7th of August. This lead also proved fruitless. On the 12th of August, police launched an appeal to trace the driver of a 4-door dark green saloon car. A taxi driver stated that he seen him thrashing his arms as he struggled with two young girls inside the vehicle as he drove on the A142 south of Soham towards Newmarket around the same time the girls were last seen. This vehicle was last seen turning into Studlands Park housing estate. The following evening, a jogger alerted police to two mounds of recently disturbed earth that he'd seen at Warren Hill, just outside Newmarket. The following evening, a jogger alerted police to two mounds of recently disturbed earth that he'd seen at Warren Hill, just outside of Newmarket, which he speculated might have been the burial locations of the two girls. An overnight examination revealed them to be badger sets. One person who claimed to have spoken to the girls immediately before their disappearance was 28-year-old Huntley, who informed investigators on the 5th of August that he had a brief conversation with both girls at his doorstep on the previous afternoon. According to Huntley, Wells and Chapman were both happy as Larry, had briefly inquired as to whether his partner, Carr, had been successful in a recent application for a full-time teaching assistant position at their school. When he replied Carr did not get the job, one of the girls said, "Tell her we're sorry," before they both walked along College Street towards the bridge leading towards Clay Street. Police were suspicious of Huntley's account. A single police officer searched his house on the 5th of August. No incriminating evidence was discovered, but the officer noticed items of clothing on the washing line despite the fact it had been raining. In reference to the evident extensive cleaning of his house interior, Huntley said, "Excuse the dining room, we had a flood." This officer was unconvinced by Huntley's claims and suspicions of his agitated demeanour. Huntley remained a strong suspect. On the 6th of August, Huntley drove from Soham to Grimsby to pick up Carr. Shortly before the two returned to College Close, a neighbour of Carr's mother named Marion Clift saw the couple standing at the rear of the vehicle with the boot open. According to Clift, a pale, shaking Huntley gazed into the boot for several moments, while Carr stood alongside him, her head bowed, weeping. When Huntley became aware of Clift's presence, he abruptly closed the boot. Ian Huntley, interviewed by Sky News correspondent Jeremy Thompson on the 15th of August 2002. At about 12:30pm on the 17th of August, Keith Pryor discovered the bodies of both girls lying side by side in a 5-foot-deep irrigation ditch close to a pheasant pen near the perimeter fence of Arieth Lake and Heath in Suffolk, more than 10 miles east of Soham. Pryor had noticed what he later described as an unusual and unpleasant smell in the area several days earlier. While returning to the area with two friends on the 17th of August, he had decided to investigate the cause. Walking through an overground verge about 600 yards from a partially tarmacked road, Pryor and Adrian Lawrence discovered the children's bodies. Lawrence immediately turned to his girlfriend, Helen Sawyer, and shouted. Lawrence immediately reported discoveries to the police. The girls had been missing for 13 days when their bodies were found, and their corpses were in an advanced state of decomposition. In an apparent effort to destroy forensic evidence, the culprit had attempted to burn both bodies. No clear footprints were discovered at the crime scene. Despite this, investigators rapidly deduced who the girls most likely were, and that they had not passed away where their bodies had been discovered. Numerous hairs later detected to belong to Chapman were discovered on a tree branch close to the location of the girls' bodies. The following day, Cambridgeshire Deputy Chief Constable Keith Hodder released a press statement to the media confirming the discovery of the children's bodies, adding that both families had been informed of the developments and that although positive formal identification would take several days, investigators were as certain as they possibly could be the bodies were of those of Wells and Chapman. On the 21st of August, the bodies of both girls were identified via DNA testing. 9 days later, a public memorial service was held at Ely Cathedral for both girls. This service was attended by about 2,000 people, including the girls' classmates, teachers, and 6 family liaison officers who had provided 24-hour service for both families. The Reverend Tim Alban Jones officiated the service, saying, "Would not the best and most lasting memorial of these two lovely girls be a change for the better in how we behave towards each other? Today's service is a small milestone in our shared journey of grief and sorrow. It is our hope that we may perhaps draw a line under one phase of our grieving and begin to look forward." An online book of condolence attracted more than 31,000 messages of grief and sympathy, and on the 24th of August, football clubs across Britain held a minute's silence before games. The inquest into the children's death was held at Shire Hall, Cambridge on the 23rd of August 2002. Coroner David Morris testified that the bodies of both girls were partially skeletonized and that no precise cause of death could be determined for either of them. He also stated that the girls had almost certainly not died at the location where their bodies had been discovered, and that both bodies had been placed there within 24 hours of their deaths. These conclusions were physically supported by an analysis of the shoots of nettles at the crime scene, which enabled forensic ecologist and palynologist Patricia Wiltshire to estimate that the bodies had been placed at the location almost 2 weeks before. The funeral services for Wells and Chapman were held on consecutive days in September 2002. Both services were held at St Andrew's Parish Church and officiated by Tim Alban Jones, and the girls are buried in graves next to each other in Soham's Fordham Road Cemetery, following ceremonies attended only by family and close friends. At the request of both families, the media refrained from reporting on either service. In the weeks following their disappearances, Huntley granted several television interviews to media outlets such as Sky News and the regional BBC News programme, BBC Look East, speaking of the general shock in the local community and the dismay at being the last person to see the children alive. By the second week of the children's disappearance, Huntley had become an unofficial spokesman for the community of Soham. His explanation for this was that he wanted to convey to the media the frustration and despair the community was feeling. In one interview with Sky News correspondent Jeremy Thompson during the second week of the search, he claimed to have been holding on to a glimmer of hope that the children would be found safe and well, and that he had last seen the girls walking in the direction of a local library. Carr was also interviewed by the press during the second week of the search for the children. In this live interview, Carr corroborated Huntley's claim to have conversed with the children on their doorstep, as she had been bathing before both girls had walked away from the doorstep, adding, discussing the personalities of the girls, Carr described Wells as being the more feminine of the two, adding that Chapman was more of a tomboy, and that one occasion she jokingly remarked to Chapman how, unlike many of her friends, she rarely wore a skirt. To this question, Carr stated that the child had expressed her desire to be a bridesmaid at her own future wedding, adding that Chapman had said she would willingly wear a dress for such occasion. Carr also displayed a thank you card to this reporter which had been recently given to her by Wells on the last day of the school year. Referring to Wells in the past tense, Carr stated, before making a direct appeal to the children, by the second week of the children's disappearance, Huntley had begun to lose weight and was displaying visible symptoms of insomnia. To one officer he said, before beginning to weep. His erratic behaviour and apparent distress led him to being prescribed antidepressants on the 13th of August. Having participated in the search for the children, Huntley regularly asked police officers questions as to how much the investigation was progressing and how long DNA evidence would survive before deteriorating. One of these officers observed 3 vertical scratches on Huntley's left jaw, each measuring approximately 3 centimetres, which he claimed had been recently inflicted by his dog. On the 16th of August, 12 days after the children's disappearance, Huntley and Carr were both questioned by police. Both were questioned for approximately 7 hours. Each provided witness statements before being placed in a safe house in the village of Histon. By this date, police had received information from several Grimsby residents who had recognised Huntley in the television interviews he had given and recalled that he had been accused of assault several years earlier. Others said that, contrary to her televised claims, Carr had been socialising in Grimsby town centre on the night of the girl's disappearance and was not at home in Soham as she claimed to the media. The same evening, police conducted a thorough search of both 5 College Close and the grounds of Soham Village College, where Huntley worked as a couple remained under watch at separate locations outside Soham. Each room of Huntley's home had evidently been recently and meticulously cleaned with what was later described as being lemony cleaning fluid. But the search of the home revealed many items of major importance to the investigation. The evidence and artefacts were not made public at the time, but the items recovered from the school grounds included items of clothing the girls had been wearing when last seen. Their charred and cut Manchester United shirts were recovered from a bin in a hanger at Huntley's place of work. Fibres recovered from these garments were a precise match to the samples received from Huntley's body and clothing, as well as from 5 College Close. His fingerprints were also recovered from the bin. Huntley's Ford Fiesta was also forensically examined on the 16th of August. This revealed that the car had also been extensively cleaned, but traces of a mixture of brick dust, chalk and concrete of the same type used to pave the road leading to where the girl's body would be discovered were also found around the wheel arches and around the pedals. A cover from the rear seat was missing, and the lining of the boot had been recently removed and replaced with an ill-fitting section of household carpet. Having discovered the children's clothes at Soham Village College, police decided to arrest Huntley and Carr. Both were arrested on suspicion of abduction and unaliving at 4:30 a.m. on the 17th of August. Investigators had stated on the 7th of August they strongly believed that the girls had been abducted and announced their strong suspicions that both girls had been unalived on this date. During initial questioning, Huntley refused to answer questions and appeared evasive, confused, and emotionally detached, occasionally drooling during police attempts to question him in an effort to feign mental illness. This left police with no option but to refer Huntley to a mental health hospital to undergo an extensive psychological evaluation. By contrast, Carr quickly confessed to detectives that she had lied about her whereabouts and her partner's actions on the 4th of August as, shortly before she had returned to Soham from Grimsby 3 days later, Huntley had claimed to her in a phone call to have seen the 2 girls shortly before the disappearance, admitting, "The thing is, Maxine, they came in our house." According to Carr, Huntley then informed her the children had entered their home in order that Wells would stanch her nosebleed. He then claimed to her Chapman had sat on their bed and he had helped Wells control the bleeding from her nose before both girls had left the home. Referencing one of the 1998 apes he had committed, but had earlier claimed to her to have been falsely accused of in a phone call. Huntley then began voicing concerns as to again being falsely accused of involvement on this occasion, also claiming his previous arrest had caused him to suffer a nervous breakdown. She had therefore later agreed to conduct a false story with a partner to support his version of events. After being informed of the discovery of the children's bodies and the evidence of Huntley's guilt, including his fingerprints being recovered from the bin in which the children's clothes had been found, Carr burst into tears shouting. Despite these revelations, Carr initially remained emotionally attached to Huntley and professed a belief in his innocence to both police and her family. By the 20th of August, investigators had established sufficient physical evidence from Huntley's home, vehicle and Soham Village College to charge him with 2 counts of unaliving. He was charged with these offences while detained for observation at Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, and all preliminary hearings against him were postponed until the conclusion of his mental health assessment. Carr was also charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice on this date. She was further charged with 2 counts of assisting an offender on the 17th of January 2003. While held on remand at Holloway Prison, Carr regularly inquired as to Huntley's welfare and wrote several letters in which she professed her continued love for him. Carr only severed contact with Huntley in December 2002. To determine Huntley's state of mental health, he was detained under Section 48 of the Mental Health Act for almost 2 months at Rampton Secure Hospital. Here, his mental state was assessed by Christopher Clark, a consultant forensic psychiatrist, to determine whether he suffered from any mental illness and whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Clark concluded in October that, although psychopathic, Huntley did not suffer from any major mental or psychotic illness. On the 8th of October, Huntley was deemed mentally competent to stand trial. Christopher Clark, consultant forensic psychologist, reciting the conclusions of his assessment of Ian Huntley's mental state in 2002. Having been declared as mentally fit to stand trial, Huntley was faced with a sentence of life imprisonment if a jury could be convinced of his guilt. He was transferred to a segregation unit at Woodhill Prison in Milton Keynes, Buckinghamshire. On the 9th of June 2003, he attempted to unalive himself by taking 29 antidepressants, which he had accumulated in his cell. Staff initially feared Huntley might pass away as a result of his overdose, but he was returned to his prison cell within 48 hours. Huntley was later transferred to London's Belmarsh Prison. At a preliminary hearing at the Old Bailey on the 16th of June 2003, Huntley pleaded not guilty to the charges of unaliving Wells and Chapman, and guilty to the charge both stood accused of, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Carr pleaded not guilty to the charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice and assisting an offender. The trial of Huntley for the unalivings of Wells and Chapman opened at the Old Bailey on the 5th of November 2003 before Mr. Justice Alan Moses. Huntley was charged with 2 counts of unaliving, to which he entered a plea of not guilty. Carr was charged with 2 counts of assisting an offender and 1 count of perverting the course of justice. In his opening statement on behalf of the Crown, Prosecutor Richard Latham QC described the last day of the girls' lives and how, by pure chance, they had happened to pass by Huntley's home at a time when Carr was not present. Latham contended Huntley had deliberately lured them into his home after approximately 6:37 p.m. and that both had been unalived shortly thereafter, with cell site analysis showing Huntley had switched off Chapman's mobile phone either outside his home or within the grounds of Soham Village College after both girls had been unalived. Latham described how mobile phone records and eyewitness accounts placed Carr in Grimsby on the evening in question, showing the statement she had given to the police and press had been false. He then outlined the details of how Keith Pryor and his 2 friends had discovered the bodies on the 17th of August at a location Huntley had known from his plane spotting hobby and where they were unlikely to be discovered. Referencing the likely motive for the girls' unaliving and the cause of death for each victim, Latham stated that, due to an extensive state of decomposition of the bodies, the coroner had been unable to determine the precise cause of death of either child, or whether they had been sexually assaulted before or after death. Latham stated that neither body showed signs of compressive neck injuries, knife wounds, drugging, or poisoning, and that both girls had most likely died of asphyxiation. In reference to Huntley's claims that both girls' unalivings had been accidental, Latham stated that only one person knows what happened. He stressed that the cause of death was unaliving, adding, 10-year-old girls don't just drop dead. In reference to Carr's attempts to pervert the course of justice, Latham stated that, as surely as night follows day, the two had conspired to conduct a false alibi to divert suspicion from Huntley, but warned the jury that Carr could only be convicted of assisting an offender if they believed that she had known Huntley had unalived the girls, adding that her motive for providing lies to the police with reference to the charge of perverting the course of justice was irrelevant. Over the course of 3 days, Latham outlined the efforts of both defendants to divert suspicion away from Huntley, and Huntley's own efforts to destroy all physical and circumstantial evidence linking him to the crime. But despite these efforts, investigators had received enough evidence to show the girls had been unalived within his home and, within approximately 12 hours of their death, transported in his vehicle to the location where the bodies had been discovered on the 17th of August. This had included fibre evidence received from Huntley's vehicle, clothes and carpets which had been a precise match to the Manchester United shirts the girl had been wearing at the time of the disappearance. Latham then closed his statement by again bringing the jury's attention to Huntley's claim that both deaths had been accidental, remarking, "We posed this question, 2 of them?" He then speculated Huntley's defence counsel may try to argue that he had been confused, commenting, "In that case, they would have to consider Huntley's behaviour over the fortnight between the girls' disappearance and their bodies being found." Testimony related to the forensic evidence linking Huntley was heard on the 24th of November. A scenes of crime officer also testified that, despite Huntley's exhaustive efforts to remove physical evidence of his crime from his home, a forensics examination had revealed several traces of blood spattering about the hallway and main entrance to the master bedroom. On the 1st of December, Huntley testified before the court in his defence. Responding to questioning in his defence counsel, Stephen Coward QC, Huntley admitted both girls had passed away in his house, but denied either death had been intentional. According to Huntley, he, Wells and Chapman had entered the bathroom to stem a mild nosebleed Wells had been suffering from when the girls had walked by his home. The bath was already filled with water as he had been cleaning his dog that afternoon. In the bathroom, he had slipped and accidentally knocked Wells into the bath while helping her stanch her nosebleed, and this unintentional act had caused her to drown, and he panicked and froze. He further claimed Chapman had witnessed this accident and began repeatedly screaming, "You pushed her," and that he had then accidentally suffocated her while attempting to stifle her screaming, which had preoccupied his attention as opposed to ensuring Wells did not drown. By this time, his state of panic had waned. It had been too late to save the lives of either of the girls, and that his first coherent memory had been of sitting on his vomit-stained landing close to Chapman's body. When questioned about his failure to call emergency services and subsequent extensive efforts to destroy evidence and divert suspicion from himself, Huntley insisted that he had become preoccupied with whether the police and public would believe the girls' passings had been accidental, and he had decided to conceal all the evidence of the unalivings as opposed to either notifying the police or paramedics. Weeping, Huntley admitted responsibility for both unalivings but repeated insistence that both unalivings had been accidental. He tearfully claimed that he had not attempted to feign insanity upon his arrest, insisting the trauma of the children's unalivings had temporarily erased his memory and being in the presence of police had caused his mind to temporarily seize. On the 3rd of December, Carr went into the witness box to testify in her own defence. Responding to questioning from her defence counsel, Michael Hubbard QC, Carr briefly discussed her initial acquaintance with Huntley, the subsequent relationship and plans to start a family once both obtained financial stability before Hubbard detected his questioning towards her return to Soham on the 6th of August and had discovering Huntley had recently washed their bedding and had evidently cleaned sections of the house. To these questions, Carr explained that her first impression had been that Huntley had a woman in the house, and in that their bedding had been washed shortly before the 4th of August. Carr further testified to having noticed a crack on the enamel in the bathtub, which had not been there when she travelled to Grimsby 4 days previously. When questioned about why she'd helped Huntley in extensively cleaning their home in the days after the children's unaliving, Carr claimed that she had done so as she'd always been obsessive about tidiness. Questioned about the efforts she had made to mislead both police and the media to divert suspicion from her partner, Carr emphasised that she'd only lied to the police, the media and anyone who asked to protect Huntley, who had repeatedly assured her of his innocence of any wrongdoing and his fear of being fitted up by police for the girl's disappearance should they discover the 1998 Arwood allegation against him. She further claimed to have referred to Wells and Chapman using past tense merely because she had worked with the children in the past. Carr said she had tried to persuade Huntley to contact the police and be open about his claims to have invited the children into their homes for Wells to stanch their nosebleed, but that he had refused to do so, as inviting children into their home had been in violation of the rules imposed by St Andrew's Primary School. She further explained her focus had therefore been to protect Huntley's job and reputation, adding that she had known of Huntley's guilt. She would never have attempted to provide him with a false alibi, stating to a counsel. Concluding his questioning, Hubbard cautioned the jury not to succumb to the temptation of judging Carr's morality, but to consider her state of mind prior to her arrest when considering whether the lies she had told warranted any criminal liability, stating that she had done no wrong on the date of the children's unaliving and had not returned to Soham until the 6th of August. On the 10th of December, counsel for both prosecution and defence delivered their closing arguments to the jury. Latham delivered his closing argument on behalf of the prosecution by describing Huntley and Carr as accomplished liars before outlining the prosecution's case that both children had unalived to satisfy Huntley's selfish self-interest, before Huntley, with Carr's support, had embarked on 12 days of cynical deception, with Carr only revealing the truth to the police after being informed of the discovery of the children's bodies. Referencing Huntley's more likely motive for the unalivings and his claims at the trial that both unalivings had been accidental, Latham stated, referencing Carr's conscious efforts to deceive police and media alike, Latham stated, following the conclusion of the prosecution's closing argument, Carr delivered his argument on behalf of the defence. He conceded that his client was guilty of physical responsibility of the girl's actual unalivings, as Huntley had admitted, and therefore deserved punishment, but argued that the prosecution had failed to provide definitive proof that Huntley had attempted to unalive the children or cause them bodily harm. Coward also contended that the prosecution had failed to provide conclusive evidence to support their claim that Huntley's actual motive for the murders had been sexual. Coward concluded his closing argument by requesting the jury to deliver a verdict of manslaughter in relation to both unalivings. Section of Mr. Justice Alan Moses' sentencing of Ian Huntley, 17th of December 2003. Following the conclusion of both counsel's closing arguments, Mr. Justice Moses announced the jury would begin their deliberations on the 12th of December. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching their verdicts against both defendants. On the 17th of December 2003, they returned a majority verdict of guilty on 2 counts of unaliving against Huntley. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of imprisonment to be imposed by the Lord Chief Justice at a later date. Huntley's face showed no emotion as the verdict was announced. The mothers of both Wells and Chapman burst into tears. Carr pleaded guilty to the charge of perverting the course of justice and not guilty to the charge of assisting an offender. The jury accepted her insistence that she had only lied to the police and media in order to protect Huntley because, prior to his arrest, she believed his claims of innocence. As such, she was found not guilty of assessing a prisoner. Carr was sentenced to serve 3.5 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. Minutes after the convictions, the parents of both girls granted an interview to the media. Discussing Huntley's mindset, Leslie Chapman opened, Huntley's motive for unaliving the children is unknown. Minutes prior to encountering Wells and Chapman, he is known to have had an argument with Carr, ending in his slamming the phone down. Huntley had allegedly suspected Carr of affairs throughout the relationship, leading his mother and some police officers to suspect that he had unalived the 2 girls in a fit of jealous rage. However, prior to his trial, a criminal profile had resulted in him being ruled as eminent criminal psychologist who had lured Wells and Chapman into his home in a moment of opportunism. The prosecution contended that Huntley's trial was most likely a sexual motive existed for the unalivings. Testimony from Carr had indicated her suspicions sexual activity had occurred in their home in her absence as, although Huntley had insisted throughout the relationship that Carr perform all domestic chores, she noticed that he had washed the quilts, pillowcases and the sheets of the bed in her absence. Pathological evidence received from the bodies indicating at least one of the girls had been essayed either before or after the unaliving was not disclosed to the jury at Huntley's trial. The reason for this decision had been that both bodies were too extensively decomposed and damaged by fire to enable a conclusive determination of either the actual cause of unaliving or if either girl had been subjected to essay. Prosecutors at Huntley's trial contended that he had lured the children into his house with a likely sexual motivation, but investigators found no evidence of premeditation in relation to the unalivings. At the September 2005 hearing, in which the minimum term Huntley should serve as before any parole liability was decided, Mr. Justice Moses stated, "Prior to unaliving Wells and Chapman, Huntley had established an extensive record of consensual and unconsensual sexual activity with females, many of whom had been under the age of consent. He would typically use guile or force to achieve his desires. Between 1992 and 2002, he had committed many acts of physical and sexual violence against women and children, for which he had been unpunished. The youngest girl Huntley is known to have assaulted is 12 years old, with another girl he had attempted to essay being 11. Following his arrest, several former girlfriends and sexual partners stated that Huntley presented himself as a charming, considerate man in the early stages of the relationship, but would become domineering and violent upon having established control. Huntley severely restricted and supervised any contact she held with her family or social acquaintances. He would also emotionally blackmail his partner if he detected any signs of her developing a resistance to his control or indicating a desire to leave him. According to one columnist, the fact that Huntley had remained unpunished for these often blatant and continuous acts had increased his confidence and reinforced his domineering misogynistic mindset and fueling his recidivism. Psychologists have also determined Huntley has mentally blocked any attempts against the reality or enormity of his actions pertaining to his repeated violence against females in order that he can cope with the consequences of his actions. An orange petal rose dedicated to the memory of Wells and Chapman was unveiled by representatives of Soham Town Council at the 2003 Chelsea Flower Show. The inspiration for dedicating a flower to the children's memory came from a poem read aloud at the memorial service at Ely Cathedral on the 30th of August 2002 by Wells' father, titled Soham's Rose. On the 3rd of April 2004, the three-bedroomed house in College Close in which the unalivings occurred was demolished and the site levelled, with all rubble of the property being discarded in various undisclosed locations. The site where 5 College Close once stood is now a vacant patch of grass. Within days of Huntley's formal sentencing, he reflected to the media on the prospect of spending the remainder of his life behind bars and his fears for his security, exclaiming, "In the years since his incarceration, Huntley has been repeatedly attacked by other inmates. On the 14th of September 2005, while an inmate at HM Prison Wakefield, he was scalded by boiling water by convicted spree unaliver Mark Hobson. The injuries Huntley received in this attack resulted in him being unable to attend the hearing at which his minimum term of imprisonment was decided. Following this attack, Huntley alleged that the prison authorities had failed on their duty to care towards him, and launched a claim for £15,000 in compensation. He was reportedly awarded £2,500 in legal aid to pursue this claim. Huntley was transferred from Wakefield Prison to Falkland Prison on the 23rd of January 2008. 2 years later, on the 21st of March 2010, he received a non-life-threatening injuries to his neck after his throat was slashed by convicted armed robber Damien Folkes. The injuries Huntley received in this attack required hospital treatment. Huntley again applied for compensation for the injuries he had received in this attack, seeking £20,000 in damages. On the 5th of December 2006, Huntley attempted to unalive himself by taking an overdose of antidepressants which he had accumulated in his prison cell. This resulted in his hospitalisation and a thorough search of his cell, in which a cassette tape was recovered. This cassette tape contains a very different account of the unalivings of Wells and Chapman than that to which Huntley testified in his trial. In what Huntley had believed would be his posthumous confession, he claimed to have confessed to having unalived both girls to Carr prior to their arrest and his plan to confess to the authorities, to which Huntley alleged Carr had slapped his face and informed him to pull himself together, as she did not want to lose the teaching position she had yearned for all her life. Huntley further alleges Carr had encouraged him to burn both bodies in an attempt to destroy all forensic evidence linking him to the crime. It's believed Huntley had agreed to make this recording for a fellow prisoner who had hoped to later sell the confession to the media after his release, in return for being provided with the antidepressants which he had used in his attempt. In April 2007, Huntley confessed to having actually assaulted an 11-year-old girl he had dragged into an orchard in 1997. Following Huntley's admission of guilt, this victim issued a press statement in which she confessed to feeling a massive sense of relief, but concluded that the statement with the sentence, Carr was released on probation from HM Prison Foston Hall on the 14th of May 2004 after serving a total of 21 months imprisonment, including 16 months she had been detained whilst on remand. She was given a secret identity to protect her from threats of attack in addition to being provided with a new home in an undisclosed location. At the time, Carr was one of 4 former prisoners in the UK to be given a new identity upon release. Carr won an injunction on the 24th of February 2005, granted her lifelong anonymity on the grounds that her life would otherwise be in danger. The costs of imposing this order have been reported by differing tabloid newspapers as being between $1 million and $50 million. At least a dozen women have been falsely identified as Carr and either persecuted or physically attacked due to false stories speculating as to her whereabouts and new identity which have been printed in tabloid publications. Shortly after her release from prison, Carr and her family contacted a Tyneside-based publishing company with a view to publishing her autobiography. Mirage Publishing initially agreed to publish Carr's autobiography, but withdrew their offer after a feature on BBC Radio Newcastle prompted scores of complaints from the public. Immediately after Huntley's conviction, previous criminal allegations against him were made public. These disclosures revealed that not only police had failed to pursue previous criminal complaints of sexual offences against underage girls and young women by Huntley, but he had secured a job in Soham, allowing him to access children. Upon learning of these public disclosures, Home Secretary David Blunkett announced a public inquiry into the intelligence-based record-keeping and vetting system which had allowed Huntley to obtain employment as a school caretaker, despite these previous criminal complaints, which had been reported to police and social services. Chaired by Sir Michael Bychard, the Bychard Inquiry opened on the 13th of January 2004. The results of this inquiry were published that June. The stated purpose of the Bychard Inquiry was: one of the issues scrutinised by Bychard's report surfaced almost immediately when Humberside Police stated their belief that it was unlawful under the Data Protection Act to hold data regarding criminal allegations which had not led to a conviction. This claim was criticised by other police forces who thought this was too strict an interpretation of the Act. The inquiry scrutinised the investigation by Cambridgeshire Police into the children's disappearance and unalivings. Almost 2 weeks had elapsed following the disappearance of Wells and Chapman before Cambridgeshire Police became aware of Huntley's previous criminal background, despite his claims to be the last person to see the children alive. Further criticism was directed at the force for their initial failure to scrutinise Carr's claims to have been in Soham on the date of the children's disappearance. The inquiry also severely criticised Humberside Police for deleting information relating to previous criminal allegations against Huntley, and also criticised Cambridgeshire Police for not allowing standard vetting guidelines. Both the Humberside and Cambridgeshire Police were heavily criticised for their failings in maintaining criminal intelligence records of Huntley. Bychard later ordered the suspension of Chief of Humberside Police David Westwood for ordering the destruction of records pertaining to alleged child M-word, which had not resulted in a conviction. The suspension was later overturned. Westwood retired in March 2005. The Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire Constabulary, Tom Lloyd, was also subjected to severe criticism as his force had failed to contact Humberside Police during the investigation into Huntley's criminal background prior to his securing employment at Soham Village College. An added complication in these criminal vetting procedures was the fact that Huntley had applied for the caretaker's job under the name of Ian Nixon, although he divulged on the application form for this position that he was previously known as Ian Huntley. It is believed that Cambridgeshire Police failed to perform a background check under the name of Huntley. Had they done so, they would have discovered an outstanding burglary charge on file relating to his November 1995 arrest for this crime. The Bideford Inquiry recommends a mandatory registration scheme for people working with children and vulnerable adults such as the elderly and mentally handicapped. This recommendation letter led to the foundation of the Independent Safeguarding Authority. The findings also suggested a national system that would be implemented for police forces to share intelligence information, and that all police forces should follow a clear code of practice on record keeping. These findings ultimately led to the tightening of various procedures within the Criminal Records Bureau system, including compulsory checks into potential criminal backgrounds of people who apply to work with children.